The morning light filtered through my kitchen window as I reached for my purse, but my hand found empty space where my bank card should have been. My son Marcus stood in the doorway, that familiar smirk playing across his lips. He held the small plastic rectangle between two fingers like a playing card. The 73 years of trust between us crumbled as he spoke those words that would change everything. Comment below from your city and tell me if your children respect your savings. What he didn't know about that account would shock him to his core. Marcus slipped the card into his wallet with practiced ease, as if this theft was nothing more than borrowing sugar from a neighbor. "Mom, it's just your retirement," he said, adjusting his expensive tie. "You don't need it anymore." The audacity burned in my chest like acid reflux after too much coffee. 27 years old and still treating me like his personal ATM. His designer shoes clicked against my worn linoleum as he headed for the door, but something in my expression made him pause. The bank statements I'd been hiding in my jewelry box told a different story than the one Marcus assumed. While he saw a lonely widow with a modest pension, the truth was far more complicated. My late husband Robert had been more than just a factory foreman. Those late nights at the plant, the mysterious phone calls, the locked filing cabinet in our basement, the safety deposit box key hidden inside my grandmother's pearl necklace, had been waiting for this moment for 3 long years. Standing there in my faded housecoat, watching my only child walk away with what he thought was my life savings, I made a decision that would either save our relationship or destroy it forever. The account he'd stolen access to contained exactly $2,147.63 in retirement funds, standard for a woman my age in rural Pennsylvania. Marcus had done his homework, watching my transactions, calculating my vulnerability. What he hadn't calculated was that this account was just the tip of an iceberg that went deeper than he could imagine. My neighbor Agnes knocked on the front door just as Marcus's BMW pulled out of the driveway. She'd been watching from her kitchen window again, her gray hair in curlers and her face creased with concern. "Dorothy, was that your boy taking money again?" she asked, stepping inside without invitation. Agnes had raised 4 sons of her own, buried 2 husbands, and survived the closure of 3 local factories. Her opinion carried weight in this neighborhood where everyone knew everyone's business since 1972. The kitchen table where Robert and I had shared 38 years of morning coffee became my war room. Agnes poured herself a cup from my old percolator while I spread out the documents I'd kept hidden for too long. Bank routing numbers, account statements, and a legal document dated September 15, 2021, the day after Robert's funeral. Marcus thought he was clever, but he'd just triggered a sequence of events that would reveal the truth about his father's legacy. That afternoon, Marcus called from his downtown office, his voice dripping with false concern. "Mom, I transferred $500 to my account for groceries and utilities," he lied smoothly. The bank alert on my phone showed a withdrawal of $1,200. Groceries and utilities indeed. His casino debts and expensive lifestyle were bleeding me dry, one transaction at a time. What he didn't know was that every withdrawal was being monitored by someone other than his helpless old mother. The real game began when I opened my laptop, a skill Marcus assumed I'd never mastered. Technology wasn't foreign to me. I'd simply let him believe it was. My fingers moved across the keyboard with purpose, accessing accounts he'd never seen. The first transfer of $50,000 from the hidden account to my checking account took less than 30 seconds. The second transfer, for $75,000, took even less time. By dinner, the retirement account Marcus had emptied would be fuller than it had ever been. Agnes returned the next morning with her daughter Sarah, a paralegal who specialized in elder financial abuse cases. Sarah's briefcase contained forms, legal precedents, and a recording device smaller than a deck of cards. "Mrs. Morrison, what your son is doing constitutes theft," Sarah explained, her pen poised over official documents. "The fact that you're his mother doesn't give him legal access to your funds." The irony was rich. Marcus thought he was protecting his inheritance, but he was actually jeopardizing it with every fraudulent transaction. The safety deposit box at First National Bank held secrets that would make Marcus's head spin. Robert's insurance policy wasn't the modest $25,000 affair we'd told everyone about. The real policy, purchased through his union connections and hidden from family discussions for decades, was worth $800,000. Add to that his secret savings account, his stock portfolio managed by a firm in Pittsburgh, and the mineral rights to land his grandfather had purchased in 1948. The total value approached $2 million. When Marcus arrived for his weekly dinner visit, I was ready. The dining room table was set with Robert's good china, the kind we'd saved for special occasions. Tonight was definitely special. Marcus noticed the manila envelope beside his plate, but said nothing, too busy calculating how much more he could steal before I caught on. The envelope contained copies of every fraudulent transaction, time-stamped and cross-referenced with his personal spending. The evidence was damning, but it was just the appetizer for what was coming next. "Son, we need to talk about your father's estate," I said, pouring sweet tea into crystal glasses that hadn't seen light since Robert's funeral. Marcus looked up from his phone, finally paying attention. The word estate had a magical effect on his greedy sensibilities. He assumed this conversation would be about updating my will, making sure he inherited my modest savings without complications. The real conversation was going to be about theft, fraud, and the consequences of underestimating a woman who'd kept secrets for 40 years. The photograph I placed on the table showed Robert shaking hands with 3 men in expensive suits outside a downtown building. The date stamp read, July 1983. Marcus studied the image with confusion, recognizing his father, but not understanding the significance. "Your dad wasn't just a factory worker," I explained, watching his face change. "He was a safety inspector for the state, investigating workplace violations that companies paid handsomely to keep quiet. The payments had been substantial, carefully invested, and completely legal once properly reported as consulting fees." Marcus's confidence wavered for the first time in months. He'd built his entire financial strategy around the assumption that his mother was poor, vulnerable, and dependent on his charity. The reality was shifting beneath his feet like quicksand. "How much are we talking about, Mom?" he asked, his voice smaller now. The greed was still there, but it was tempered by uncertainty. The bank card in his wallet suddenly felt heavier, more dangerous. What he'd stolen was pocket change, compared to what he stood to lose. The second photograph showed Robert at a real estate closing, signing papers for property Marcus had never heard of. 200 acres of farmland outside Uniontown, purchased in 1987 and leased to agricultural companies ever since. The annual income from that land alone exceeded Marcus's salary at the insurance firm where he processed claims and skimmed client accounts. "Your father was building something for our family's future," I said, my voice steady despite the betrayal burning in my chest. "Something you're destroying one stolen dollar at a time." Agnes appeared in the kitchen doorway, her timing perfect as always. She'd been listening from the hallway, ready to serve as witness to whatever confession or confrontation was about to unfold. "Dorothy, should I call Sarah?" she asked, her hand already reaching for her cell phone. Marcus looked between us, finally understanding that his actions had consequences beyond his mother's tears. The legal machinery was already in motion, grinding toward a resolution that would either teach him respect or cost him everything. The bank statements I spread across the table told the story of systematic theft spanning 8 months. Small amounts at first, $20 or $30 for emergencies that never materialized, then larger sums as his confidence grew and my protests weakened. The total stolen amount was $4,192.76, documented down to the penny. Each transaction was a separate count of fraud, a separate betrayal of trust. The evidence was overwhelming, but Marcus still hadn't grasped the full scope of his miscalculation. "Mom, you're being dramatic," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. The swagger was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like fear. "It's not like you need the money for anything important." Those words sealed his fate. The retirement account he'd been pillaging was indeed modest, meant for grocery money and medical expenses. The real estate portfolio, the stock dividends, the mineral rights payments, the insurance policy proceeds. Those accounts remained untouched, invisible to his greedy calculations. The turning point came when I opened my laptop and showed him the real numbers. Account balances that made his annual salary look like lunch money. Investment returns that had been compounding for decades. property values that had skyrocketed since Robert's careful purchases in the 80s and 90s. Marcus stared at the screen in silence, his face cycling through shock, anger, and something that might have been shame. The mother he'd been robbing was wealthier than he'd ever dreamed of becoming. "Why didn't you tell me?" he whispered, and for a moment I saw the little boy who used to crawl into our bed during thunderstorms. But that boy had grown into a man who saw his mother as a mark, not a person. The secrecy had been protection, not punishment. Robert and I had planned to reveal everything when Marcus proved himself responsible, worthy of the trust that generational wealth required. That day had been postponed indefinitely by his actions, but the reckoning had finally arrived. The legal documents Sarah had prepared were comprehensive and devastating. Power of attorney revocation, removing Marcus from all financial accounts and decisions. A restraining order preventing him from contacting me regarding money matters. Most importantly, a formal complaint with the district attorney's office documenting the theft and requesting prosecution. The papers required only my signature to transform family drama into criminal charges. Marcus read them twice, his hands shaking slightly as the reality sank in. "You can't be serious about this," he said, but the denial was hollow. The evidence was overwhelming, the legal precedents clear. Elder financial abuse carried serious penalties in Pennsylvania, especially when the amounts exceeded $5,000. His theft had crossed that threshold 3 months ago, elevating the charges from misdemeanor to felony territory. The insurance company where he worked had zero-tolerance policies for employees with financial crimes on their records. His career was in jeopardy, along with his freedom. Agnes squeezed my shoulder as I picked up the pen, her silent support more valuable than any legal counsel. 40 years of friendship had prepared her for this moment, watching my son's greed destroy the family Robert and I had sacrificed to build. "Dorothy, you're doing the right thing," she said quietly. "Sometimes love means holding people accountable for their choices." The ink flowed smoothly across the signature line, sealing Marcus's fate with a flourish that Robert would have appreciated. The transformation in Marcus was immediate and complete. The arrogant young man who'd stolen my bank card was replaced by someone desperate, pleading, making promises he should have kept months ago. "Mom, please, I'll pay back every penny," he begged. But the time for voluntary repayment had passed. Trust, once broken, required more than words to rebuild. The legal process would run its course regardless of his newfound remorse, teaching him lessons about consequences that his upbringing had apparently failed to instill. Sarah gathered the signed documents with professional efficiency, explaining the timeline for prosecution and the steps I could expect in the coming weeks. Criminal charges would be filed within 72 hours, followed by an arraignment where Marcus would learn the full scope of his legal jeopardy. The stolen money would be recovered through court-ordered restitution, but the damage to our relationship might prove irreparable. Some mistakes cost more than money. They cost family bonds that had taken decades to forge. The irony was bitter and complete. Marcus had stolen my retirement money because he thought I was vulnerable, dependent, and defenseless. The truth was that I was wealthier than he'd ever imagined, connected to legal resources he couldn't challenge, and protected by friendships he'd never bothered to cultivate. His greed had blinded him to the reality of his situation, leading him to attack the very person who held his financial future in her hands. That evening, alone in the house where Robert and I had raised our son, I opened the safety deposit box documents one final time. The inheritance Marcus had been so eager to claim was substantial enough to set up his children and their children for generations. College funds, business investments, real estate holdings that would appreciate for decades to come. All of it contingent on proving himself worthy of the responsibility that real wealth demanded. All of it now in jeopardy because he couldn't wait for the proper time. The next morning brought a call from Marcus's supervisor at the insurance company, a woman named Patricia who'd worked with Robert years ago on a fraud investigation. Word traveled fast in professional circles, especially when it involved criminal charges against employees with access to client funds. "Dorothy, I'm sorry to hear about your situation," Patricia said. "We'll need to suspend Marcus pending the outcome of his case." The dominoes were falling exactly as Sarah had predicted, each consequence flowing naturally from his criminal choices. Agnes brought coffee and comfort, settling into Robert's old chair as if she belonged there. Maybe she did, after 40 years of shared neighborhoods, borrowed sugar, and mutual support through life's challenges. "You know Robert would be proud of you," she said, stirring cream into her cup. "He always said you were stronger than people realized." The strength had been there all along, hidden beneath years of playing the helpless widow to protect family secrets. Now it blazed openly, defending what Robert and I had built together. The district attorney's office moved quickly, as Sarah had promised. Within a week, Marcus faced 5 counts of fraud, 3 counts of elder abuse, and 2 counts of identity theft for using my bank card without permission. The total potential sentence exceeded 10 years if convicted on all counts. His lawyer, a public defender overwhelmed with cases, recommended accepting a plea bargain that would require full restitution, probation, and community service. The alternative was a trial that would expose his crimes to public scrutiny and potential civil liability. Marcus chose the plea bargain, admitting guilt in exchange for a reduced sentence. The judge who presided over his case was a woman in her 60s who'd seen too many families destroyed by financial abuse. Her words were sharp and unforgiving as she outlined the terms of his probation and the consequences of any future violations. The court-ordered restitution included interest and penalties, bringing the total amount to $6,127.84. More importantly, the conviction would follow him for the rest of his life, a permanent reminder of the cost of betraying family trust. The media attention was minimal but devastating to Marcus's reputation. A small item in the local newspaper about elder financial abuse, charges against an insurance company employee. No names mentioned, but everyone in town knew everyone else's business. His wife Linda called me the day after the story ran, her voice thick with tears and embarrassment. "Dorothy, I had no idea what he was doing," she said. "He told me the money was from your gift for the kids' school clothes." Even his marriage was built on lies about stolen money. The redemption, if it came at all, would take years to achieve. Marcus lost his job, his professional reputation, and most of his friends. Linda filed for separation, taking their 2 children to live with her parents in Ohio. The house they'd purchased with stolen money went into foreclosure, adding financial ruin to his legal troubles. Sometimes justice arrived not as dramatic revenge, but as natural consequences for unnatural choices. The universe had a way of balancing accounts that human courts could never fully address. 6 months later, I received a letter from Marcus written on prison stationery. His handwriting was smaller, more careful, as if he'd learned to conserve everything including ink. The letter contained no excuses, no blame for others, no self-pity about his circumstances. Just a simple acknowledgement of his crimes and a request for the possibility of eventual forgiveness. The humility was new, born from consequences he'd never imagined while living in the bubble of his own entitlement. Agnes and I celebrated my 74th birthday at the country club, where Robert and I had been members for 20 years. The dining room overlooked rolling hills that stretched to the horizon, land that held mineral rights Robert had purchased with his first big payoff from consulting work. The irony was delicious. Marcus had stolen pocket change while sitting on a fortune that could have supported him for life. Greed had made him blind to the very thing he'd been searching for. The estate planning attorney, who'd helped Robert structure our holdings, visited that afternoon, updating documents and beneficiaries to reflect the new reality. Marcus remained in the will, but his inheritance was now held in trust, managed by professionals who would prevent future financial abuse. His children would benefit from their grandfather's wisdom, even if their father had rejected it. Generational wealth required generational responsibility, a lesson Marcus might still learn during his years of mandated introspection. The bank card that had started this entire saga sat in my jewelry box next to the safety deposit box key, both symbols of trust betrayed and consequences earned. Sometimes I took them out and remembered the morning when my son revealed his true character, the moment when unconditional love met conditional behavior. The cards themselves were worthless plastic, but they represented something precious that had been lost and might someday be recovered through genuine change and earned redemption. The secret I'd kept from Marcus had been protection, not punishment, designed to preserve family wealth across generations. Robert and I had watched too many families destroy themselves fighting over money, children who felt entitled to inheritance before they'd earned the wisdom to manage it. Our plan had been to reveal everything gradually, teaching responsibility alongside opportunity. Marcus's impatience had short-circuited that process, forcing a confrontation that might have been avoided with patience and respect. Agnes often reminded me that tough love was still love, even when it felt like punishment to everyone involved. The legal consequences Marcus faced were society's way of teaching lessons that family had failed to instill. Sometimes, children needed to learn from strangers what parents couldn't teach, needed to face real consequences before they understood the value of what they'd taken for granted. The law was harsh, but fair, treating his crimes as crimes regardless of family relationships. The house felt different now, lighter somehow despite the sadness of family fracture. The secrets were gone, the hidden documents revealed, the elaborate deceptions unnecessary. What remained was the simple truth of a life well lived, a marriage that had created lasting value, and wealth that would benefit future generations if properly managed. The drama was over, but the story would continue through grandchildren who might prove more worthy of their grandfather's legacy. A year after Marcus's conviction, his daughter Sophie called me for the first time since the arrest. She was 16, old enough to understand that money came from work, not theft, and that family relationships required respect to survive. "Grandma Dorothy, I want to learn about what Grandpa built," she said, her voice carrying a maturity that her father had never possessed. The next generation might redeem the mistakes of this one, might prove worthy of trust that had been violated but not destroyed. The rehabilitation of family relationships, if it happened at all, would require more than apologies and good intentions. Trust was like fine china. Once broken, it could be repaired, but never restored to its original strength. Marcus would need to demonstrate through years of honest behavior that his criminal phase was an aberration, not a character revelation. The burden of proof rested entirely with him, as it should when someone betrayed the fundamental trust between parent and child. The final entry in Robert's hidden journal, discovered while organizing his papers, contained advice that proved prophetic. "Money reveals character," he'd written. "It doesn't change people. It shows who they really are under the surface politeness and family obligations." Marcus's character had been revealed completely during those months of theft, showing greed where there should have been gratitude, entitlement where there should have been respect. The revelation had been painful, but necessary. The cottage in Maine, where Robert and I had honeymooned, became my retreat during the difficult months of legal proceedings and family destruction. The ocean had a way of putting human drama in perspective, its endless rhythm suggesting that personal problems were temporary while natural forces were eternal. Walking the same beach where we'd planned our life together, I found peace with decisions that had seemed impossible in the heat of betrayal and anger. Justice had been served, but healing would take much longer. The estate lawyer's final report showed the true scope of what Marcus had jeopardized through his greed. Total assets exceeding $2.3 million, accumulated through 4 decades of careful investment and Robert's legitimate but secretive consulting income. The mineral rights alone generated $47,000 annually in royalties, more than enough to support a comfortable lifestyle without touching principal. Marcus had stolen coins while sitting on a treasure chest, too impatient and arrogant to wait for the proper inheritance that was already his. The community response had been overwhelmingly supportive, neighbors and friends rallying around a woman they'd watched struggle with an impossible situation. Church members brought casseroles and conversation. Former co-workers shared stories of Robert's integrity and kindness. Even strangers offered support after reading about elder financial abuse in the local newspaper. The isolation Marcus had counted on never materialized. Instead, his crimes had strengthened community bonds and highlighted the importance of protecting vulnerable populations from family predators. Today, sitting in the kitchen where this story began, I can see Agnes tending her garden and preparing for another day of friendship that has sustained us through life's challenges. The bank cards remain in my jewelry box, reminders of trust betrayed and consequences earned. The secret accounts are no longer secret, their existence serving family purposes they were always intended for. Marcus serves his sentence, hopefully learning lessons that will make him worthy of eventual redemption. The wealth Robert created remains intact, waiting for the next generation to prove themselves deserving of its stewardship. The story ends not with revenge satisfied, but with justice served, family boundaries re-established, and hope that future generations will honor the sacrifices that created their opportunities. Money had revealed character, consequences had followed choices, and truth had emerged from years of carefully maintained secrets. The retirement account Marcus had dismissed as unimportant had been exactly that, a modest sum for an extraordinary woman who had learned that sometimes the greatest gift parents can give their children is the chance to face the consequences of their choices. Subscribe and share your thoughts about family, trust, and the true cost of betrayal. Sometimes love requires letting people fall so they can learn to stand. The months following Marcus's sentencing brought unexpected revelations about Robert's true legacy, discoveries that would have shocked even me during our marriage. Agnes found the first clue while helping me clean out the basement storage room where Robert had kept his mysterious filing cabinet locked for decades. Behind dusty Christmas decorations and forgotten photo albums sat a metal strongbox that required 2 keys to open. The first key hung on Robert's old keychain. The second was hidden inside his favorite coffee mug, the one I'd refused to wash or move since his death 3 years ago. Inside the strongbox lay documents that painted a picture of a man far more complex than the gentle factory worker I'd married. Government contracts dating back to 1975, when Robert had first been recruited by state environmental agencies to investigate industrial safety violations. His methodical nature and technical expertise had made him invaluable for documenting corporate malfeasance that regulatory agencies couldn't prove in court. The consulting fees had started modestly, but grew substantially as his reputation for discretion and accuracy spread throughout official circles. The most shocking discovery was a leather-bound ledger containing detailed records of every payment Robert had received over 30 years of covert consulting work. Names of companies, dates of investigations, amounts paid for his silence about violations that could have cost them millions in fines and cleanup costs. The total amount exceeded $1.8 million, all of it carefully invested and legally documented through a network of shell companies and trust accounts. Marcus had unknowingly stolen lunch money from a millionaire's widow. Agnes whistled low as we reviewed page after page of Robert's careful accounting, each entry cross-referenced with bank deposits and investment purchases. "Dorothy, your husband was running a one-man intelligence operation," she said, her finger tracing entries that showed payments from companies we'd shopped at for years. The local chemical plant that employed half the town had paid Robert $25,000 in 1987 to overlook groundwater contamination that wouldn't be publicly acknowledged until 2003. The moral complexity was staggering, but the legal documentation was flawless. The discovery explained so many mysteries from our marriage that I'd attributed to Robert's natural secretiveness. Those weekend trips to Pittsburgh that he claimed were union business were actually meetings with corporate lawyers negotiating settlements for environmental damages. The home office he'd forbidden me to enter contained not just personal files, but evidence that could have destroyed major corporations if ever made public. Robert hadn't been hiding assets from me. He'd been protecting me from knowledge that could have made us targets for corporate retaliation. Marcus called from prison the day after news broke about a major environmental lawsuit against 3 companies named in Robert's ledger. The timing was suspicious enough to make me wonder if someone had been watching our house, waiting for the right moment to act on information Robert had kept secret for decades. "Mom, are we going to be in trouble because of Dad's business?" Marcus asked, his voice smaller than I'd heard since childhood. The irony was rich. He was worried about consequences for his father's legitimate activities while serving time for his own crimes. The environmental lawyer who contacted me that week specialized in cases involving corporate cover-ups and whistleblower protections. Sarah Chen, no relation to Agnes's daughter, had built her career prosecuting companies that prioritized profits over public safety. "Mrs. Morrison, your husband's documentation could be crucial evidence in several ongoing cases," she explained during our first meeting. The ledger entries matched patterns of corporate behavior that regulatory agencies had suspected, but never proven. Robert's meticulous records were a prosecutor's dream and a corporate nightmare. The decision to cooperate with prosecutors wasn't difficult. but it required courage I hadn't known I possessed. Robert's files contained evidence of groundwater contamination, air quality violations, and toxic waste disposal practices that had affected thousands of residents over the decades. Companies had paid him to stay quiet, but they'd never required him to destroy evidence. His engineering background had compelled him to document everything, creating an archive that would finally bring justice for environmental crimes spanning 3 decades. The first lawsuit settlement came just 6 months after Robert's files were turned over to authorities. A $47 million judgment against Millfield Chemical for groundwater contamination that had caused elevated cancer rates in our neighborhood. My share as the widow of their primary consultant was legally protected, but the moral weight was crushing. Robert and I had benefited financially from corporate crimes that had literally poisoned our neighbors. The guilt was overwhelming, but the opportunity for redemption was equally powerful. Agnes developed a cough that winter, the same persistent hack that had claimed 3 other women on our street over the past 5 years. The doctor's diagnosis was lung scarring consistent with long-term exposure to industrial chemicals, the same chemicals that Millfield had been dumping illegally since the 1980s. At least now we know why, she said with characteristic stoicism, but her condition deteriorated rapidly, despite aggressive treatment. The personal cost of Robert's secret career was becoming tragically clear, even as the financial benefits continued to accumulate. The second revelation came from Robert's insurance agent, a man named William Foster, who'd worked with my husband on policies I'd never known existed. Beyond the standard life insurance policies we'd discussed openly, Robert had purchased additional coverage through professional associations and government contractor programs. The total death benefit exceeded $1.2 million, money that had been sitting in escrow accounts waiting for beneficiaries to claim it. The paperwork was complex, but Foster guided me through the process with patience born from 40 years in the insurance industry. Marcus's reaction to news about the additional insurance money was predictable and disappointing. Even from prison, his first concern was how the discovery would affect his eventual inheritance, not how his crimes had jeopardized his family's financial security. "Mom, this changes everything," he said during our monthly phone call. "When I get out, we need to talk about managing all this money properly." The audacity was breathtaking. The man who'd stolen my retirement savings was offering to manage a multi-million-dollar estate he'd never earned access to. The environmental lawsuits gained momentum as more families came forward with health problems linked to corporate pollution Robert had documented. Agnes's condition became a rallying point for community activism. Her story featured in newspaper articles and television reports about industrial contamination. The woman who'd supported me through my son's betrayal was now fighting for her life because of secrets my husband had kept for money. The moral complexity was overwhelming, but the path forward was clear. The decision to donate Robert's consulting fees to environmental cleanup efforts felt right in a way that keeping the money never could. Working with Sarah Chen and other attorneys, we established the Robert Morrison Environmental Justice Fund, dedicating $800,000 to community health initiatives and pollution remediation projects. The fund would provide medical care for affected families, environmental testing for contaminated areas, and legal support for future cases. Robert's legacy would be redemption, not profit from others' suffering. Agnes lived to see the first cleanup crew arrive at the old chemical plant site, heavy machinery finally addressing contamination that had been hidden for decades. Her hospital room overlooked the industrial district where Robert had conducted so many of his covert inspections, and she watched the work with satisfaction that transcended her physical pain. "Your husband did the right thing in the end, Dorothy," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the oxygen machine. Sometimes it takes time for justice to find its way home. The funeral for Agnes drew hundreds of mourners, testimony to a life spent caring for others, despite personal struggles and community challenges. Her 4 sons served as pallbearers, men who'd grown up understanding that family loyalty meant accountability, not unconditional support for bad behavior. The contrast with my relationship with Marcus was painful, but instructive. Agnes had raised her boys to be men. I had apparently raised mine to be dependent on his mother's resources, without respecting her authority or autonomy. Marcus's first parole hearing was scheduled for the anniversary of Agnes's death, a timing that felt symbolically appropriate. He'd served 18 months of his 3-year sentence, earning credits for good behavior and participation in financial responsibility counseling programs. The parole board would consider his rehabilitation efforts, victim impact statements, and post-release supervision plans. The decision would determine whether he'd learned anything from consequences that had cost him his career, marriage, and family relationships. The victim impact statement I prepared for the parole board was honest about both the financial harm and emotional damage Marcus's crimes had caused. He'd stolen money, but more importantly, he'd violated the trust that held our family together. Recovery would require more than serving time. It would demand genuine remorse, behavioral change, and years of consistent choices that demonstrated respect for others' rights and property. The legal system could mandate restitution, but personal redemption was a choice only Marcus could make. The environmental justice work provided purpose and meaning that helped offset the pain of family dysfunction. Speaking at community meetings about corporate accountability and environmental health connected me with other families affected by industrial pollution. The shared struggle created bonds stronger than blood relationships, alliances based on common values rather than genetic accidents. Agnes would have appreciated the irony. Losing my son had helped me find my community. The notification that Marcus would be released on supervised parole came with strict conditions that reflected the seriousness of his crimes. Electronic monitoring for the first 6 months, mandatory employment in a supervised setting, and complete financial transparency with his parole officer. Most importantly, a no-contact order preventing him from requesting or receiving money from me without court supervision. The legal system was taking no chances that his apparent rehabilitation was genuine rather than performed for parole board review. His first letter after release was different in tone and content from his previous communications, less focused on his own situation and more concerned with the damage he'd caused to our family. The handwriting was steadier, the language more mature, the sentiment apparently genuine. "Mom, I know I have years of work ahead to earn your trust again," he wrote. "I'm not asking for forgiveness yet, just the chance to prove that prison taught me lessons I should have learned at home." The humility was encouraging, but time would reveal whether it was authentic or strategic. The meeting we arranged for 6 months after his release took place at the community center, where Agnes had volunteered for 20 years. Neutral ground that honored her memory while avoiding the emotional weight of family spaces. Marcus looked older, thinner, more careful in his movements and speech. Prison had aged him beyond his years, but perhaps maturity was what he'd needed all along. The expensive clothes and arrogant swagger were gone, replaced by simple clothing and cautious humility that might indicate genuine change. "I want to help with the environmental fund," he said during our conversation. His first words focused on others rather than himself. "I know I can't undo what I did, but maybe I can contribute something positive to what Dad started." The offer was surprising and potentially meaningful, but trust would have to be earned through consistent actions over months and years. Good intentions were common in the immediate aftermath of consequences. Sustained good behavior was much rarer and more valuable. The job Marcus found at a nonprofit organization working with formerly incarcerated individuals paid barely enough to cover his basic expenses and court-ordered restitution payments. His supervisor was a woman named Maria Santos, who'd built her career helping people rebuild their lives after prison, and she reported that Marcus was reliable, hardworking, and genuinely committed to helping others avoid the mistakes he'd made. The work was meaningful, but financially challenging, a dramatic change from his previous corporate lifestyle. Linda agreed to supervised visits with their children after Marcus had been out of prison for 8 months, progress that required family counseling and careful monitoring to ensure the children's emotional safety. 10-year-old Emma and 8-year-old David barely remembered the man who'd left their lives when his crimes were exposed, but they were curious about their father and eager for family connections that divorce and incarceration had severed. The reunion was tentative but promising, supervised by professionals who understood the complex dynamics of family recovery. The first grandparent visit I'd had with Emma and David in 2 years took place at a park near their mother's apartment, carefully arranged through Linda's lawyer to ensure appropriate boundaries. The children had grown so much during their father's absence that I hardly recognized them, but their personalities remained wonderfully familiar. Emma had inherited her grandmother's love of books, while David shared his grandfather's fascination with how things worked. They asked difficult questions about their father's imprisonment with the directness that only children could manage. "Grandma Dorothy, why did Daddy take your money?" Emma asked while we fed ducks at the pond where Marcus had played as a child. The question deserved an honest answer, but one appropriate for a 10-year-old's understanding. "Sometimes adults make bad choices when they're scared or angry," I explained. "Your daddy was worried about money and made the wrong choice about how to solve his problem. Now he's learning better ways to handle difficult situations." The explanation satisfied her curiosity without destroying her relationship with her father. Marcus's progress over his first year of freedom was steady, but not spectacular, the kind of gradual improvement that suggested genuine change rather than dramatic conversion. He attended weekly counseling sessions, participated in financial management classes, and maintained employment despite low wages and challenging working conditions. More importantly, he hadn't asked me for money or tried to access family accounts since his release. The absence of entitled behavior was as significant as the presence of responsible choices. The second anniversary of Agnes's death brought the entire community together for a memorial service that celebrated her life while acknowledging the environmental justice issues that had contributed to her illness. The chemical plant had been permanently closed, its contaminated soil removed and properly disposed of for the first time in 40 years. Property values in our neighborhood were finally recovering, as environmental testing confirmed that groundwater contamination had been successfully addressed. Agnes's sacrifice had contributed to healing that benefited everyone. Marcus attended the memorial service, standing quietly in the back of the church while I spoke about Agnes's friendship and community leadership. His presence felt appropriate rather than intrusive, a sign that he understood his role in our community's recovery from both environmental and personal betrayals. After the service, several neighbors approached him with cautious but genuine expressions of support for his efforts to rebuild his life. The community that had condemned his crimes was now witnessing his attempts at redemption. The Environmental Fund had grown to over $1.2 million through settlements, donations, and investment returns, enabling expanded programs for environmental health monitoring and community education. Marcus volunteered 10 hours per week for fund activities, his background in insurance claims processing proving useful for managing paperwork and client communications. The irony was sweet. Skills he'd once used to defraud insurance companies were now serving victims of corporate environmental crimes. His rehabilitation included practical redemption for his professional abilities. The parole supervision period ended after 2 years of consistent compliance with all court orders and program requirements. Marcus's parole officer recommended early termination of supervision based on his exemplary behavior, steady employment, and positive community contributions. The legal system was satisfied that he no longer posed a risk to public safety or family financial security. Personal forgiveness was a separate process that moved on its own timeline, independent of legal rehabilitation. Sophie graduated from high school with honors and secured a full scholarship to study environmental engineering at Penn State, inspired by her grandfather's legacy and motivated by her father's mistakes. Her graduation party was the first family gathering we'd attended together since Marcus's arrest, a milestone that represented healing without forgetting the lessons learned through painful experience. The next generation was choosing different paths, informed by previous failures but not limited by them. The cottage in Maine became our annual retreat for Marcus, his children, and me, a tradition that honored Robert's memory while creating new family experiences. The conversations during those vacations were different from our pre-crisis interactions, more honest about feelings and more direct about expectations. Marcus's children were learning about their grandfather's environmental work and their grandmother's strength, stories that provided positive role models along with cautionary tales about the importance of integrity. The final revelation in Robert's papers came from a safety deposit box I'd overlooked at a small bank in downtown Pittsburgh, discovered only when that institution merged with a larger regional bank. Inside were documents showing that Robert had been working with federal environmental prosecutors for the last 5 years of his life. providing evidence that would eventually result in criminal charges against several corporate executives. His death had interrupted cooperation that might have prevented Agnes's illness and other community health problems. The federal prosecutors who'd been working with Robert contacted me through Sarah Chen, explaining that his evidence remained valuable for ongoing criminal cases against environmental polluters. 3 corporate executives were eventually sentenced to prison terms for conspiracy to violate environmental laws, their convictions based partly on documentation Robert had carefully preserved. His legacy included not just financial security for his family, but justice for community members harmed by corporate negligence. Marcus's reaction to learning about his father's cooperation with federal prosecutors was complex, mixing pride with regret about his own choices. "Dad was a real hero," he said during one of our regular phone conversations. "He risked his safety to protect people he didn't even know. I stole money from my own mother because I was too lazy to earn my own way." The comparison was harsh but accurate, highlighting the contrast between Robert's courage in serving others and Marcus's selfishness in exploiting family relationships. The decision to include Marcus back in my will was made after 3 years of consistent good behavior, regular employment, and demonstrated commitment to his children's welfare. The inheritance remained in trust, managed by professional fiduciaries who would prevent future financial abuse while providing support for legitimate needs. Trust could be rebuilt gradually, but protective measures would remain permanently in place. Love meant hoping for the best while preparing for disappointment. The trust fund structure ensured that Marcus's inheritance would benefit his children regardless of his future choices, protecting the next generation from potential relapses in judgment or behavior. Emma and David would receive distributions for education, home purchases, and other major life events, with Marcus serving as advisor but not controller of their financial resources. Robert's legacy would reach his grandchildren even if his son proved unworthy of full financial responsibility. The community recognition for environmental justice work came in the form of a state award for citizen advocacy, presented at a ceremony that honored individuals who'd fought for public health protection. Standing on that stage, holding an award that represented Agnes's sacrifice and Robert's courage, I felt the presence of both friends who'd shaped my understanding of real wealth. Money was important, but integrity was invaluable. Community was precious, but trust was priceless. Marcus accompanied me to the awards ceremony, his presence representing both personal growth and family healing. The man who'd once stolen my bank card now stood proudly as I was honored for environmental justice work funded by money he'd tried to steal. The irony was complete, but the redemption was real. His choices had revealed his character, consequences had taught him lessons, and time had provided opportunities for genuine change that legal punishment alone could never achieve. The final entry in my own journal, written 5 years after Marcus first stole my bank card, reflected on lessons learned about family, forgiveness, and the true nature of wealth. "Money reveals character, but consequences can change it," I wrote, paraphrasing Robert's wisdom with insights earned through painful experience. Trust broken can be rebuilt, but only through actions that demonstrate respect for others' rights and feelings. The real inheritance we leave our children isn't money. It's the example of how to live with integrity even when nobody's watching. Today, sitting in the same kitchen where this story began, I can see Marcus working in Agnes's old garden, teaching Emma and David about the vegetables their great-grandmother had grown for 40 years. The bank cards that started our family crisis remain in my jewelry box, reminders of trust betrayed and eventually rebuilt through patience, consequences, and genuine change. The secret accounts are no longer secret. Their purpose fulfilled through environmental justice and family healing. Sometimes the most valuable gifts parents can give their children are boundaries, consequences, and second chances earned through demonstrated change.